Hey everybody, it's Charles from HumbleMechanic.com. Today, I'm taking your questions on VW Foxes, torque wrenches, cooling fans, and more. This is episode 171 of the Humble Mechanic Podcast. All right, in order to get a question on a show like this, email me, charles@humblemechanic.com. Put question for Charles in the subject. Ask the question right at the top of the email. Hit the enter button a few times, then give me the details. That way, I know what your question is while I'm reading the details. I don't have to pick the question out of a giant paragraph. Also, if you don't see your question on a show like this, be sure to check out the Quick Videos playlist on YouTube, where I typically answer one question per video. All right, let's talk about the sponsor of the day, which is CRP Automotive. CRP deals in a ton of OE maintenance and repair parts, timing belt kits, suspension components, and even fluids. In fact, they make the factory DSG fluid for Volkswagen and Audi. So check them out at crpautomotive.com. All right, not too much more to add to that, so let's get to the questions. First one comes from Jake. Hey, I was looking at getting an '89 VW Fox. Just wondering your thoughts on it. Thanks. Awesome. I would say buy it. These older cars are awesome to get and either save from certain death or to like carry on the tradition of a car that's been well maintained or rehabbed. So I think it's awesome. A couple of things that I would probably look at if I were going to buy one. I wouldn't really care how the car ran. If it drove, awesome. If it didn't, that's okay too, but that's the kind of stuff that I know how to fix. What I would be focused on mostly is the vehicle's condition as far as the body goes. You know, if there's a little hole in the seat or a tiny crack in the dash, that's okay. But I'm talking structural issues. I'm talking car's been in an accident and the frame's bent, or the unibody's bent. Or the big one that you're really gonna wanna look for is going to be rust. Look at the vehicle, and anywhere where water can collect and sit, that's the focal points for rust. So along the windshield, along the back glass, along the windows, in those quarter panels, in the fenders, anywhere like that where water can sit are the big places that are going to be catastrophic for rust. Being an '89, it could go either way. If you're in the South or California, it's probably perfect. If you are in the Rust Belt or in the Northeast, you're probably toast. So take a good look at the car overall. Make sure that run the Carfax on it, even though it's an old car, 17 years old, almost 18. Run the Carfax in it anyway. Make sure there's no title issues. But dude, rock and roll. And if it's in great shape, keep it going. If it's not, I love to see you restore it and bring it back to the cool car that it was when it was new. All right, next one comes from Matthew. Could you do, or have you done, a review on the Sonic Tools torque wrench? I'm in the market for a new torque wrench as my Craftsman that I've been using isn't holding up as expected. I've priced both Snap-on and Matco, and they are both out of my budget for right now. Knowing you've been using Sonic Tools on the White Wookie project, I was wondering if you have used their torque wrench and what your thoughts are on it. Looking for a 20 to 200 newton meter half-inch torque wrench. So great question, Matthew. Unfortunately, I haven't done that review yet, but we're going to talk about torque wrenches anyway. And also, like most of what we've done on the Wookie is taking apart. So we haven't put too much back together. So I really haven't had an opportunity to put the screws, so to say, on any torque wrench really, but especially on the Sonic ones on the Wookie. So let's talk a little bit about torque wrenches overall. You're looking for a half-inch drive, so these are higher torque numbers. I think 20 to 200 newton meters is probably the normal range. But what I would want to know is, what are you going to be using this torque wrench for? Are you torquing wheels and lug bolts and axle bolts and suspension components? Or are you rebuilding an engine? Because that's going to really depend on which way I would point you towards a torque wrench. If you're doing engine work, very delicate engine work, where torque is 100% critical, I would tell you it's going to be worth the money to buy an expensive torque wrench. If you're doing it for suspension components and wheels, all that stuff's really important, but if you're close on a wheel torque, as long as it's even, you're probably going to be okay. For years, I used a torque wrench that I bought at Harbor Freight for like 30 bucks, and it did fantastic. Eventually, it got to the point where I could tell it wasn't tightening quite as much as it should, so I think I still have it, but I basically retired it as a torque wrench. From there, I moved to a Craftsman digital half-inch torque wrench, which from the day I bought it was a complete piece of garbage. It never worked right. I never felt like the torque was accurate. I compared it to other guys' torque wrenches in the shop. It wasn't accurate. The display would shut off. It wouldn't hold the torque. It was awful. In fact, I smashed the the torque, the digital readout portion of it because I was so frustrated with it. I think I still have the actual tool, but it will never ever be a torque wrench again. But let's move to the Sonic one. Let's talk about it. In fact, here it is right here. You'll notice that this is all nice and shiny. That's because I haven't opened the 1/2-inch drive yet. I have, however, opened the 3/8 drive, so let's talk a little bit about that. I'm gonna just open it real quick for you guys. I could have just shown you the 3/8 version, but I figured it would be, since you asked about 1/2-inch, we'll talk 1/2-inch. So this is the Sonic torque wrench, right? 1/2-inch drive. This one looks like it goes from 20 all the way up to 200, so this one would fit the bill as far as torque goes. A couple of things that I usually look at when I buy a torque wrench or any type of really high-end, specialty equipment is, again, what are we going to be doing with it? Are we going to be doing high torque, or are you going to be working more in the 30 Newton meter range? I would be more in the 3/8 drive if I was only going to be torquing to, 30 to 40 Newton meters. That's a little bit more manageable. You don't want to be up under the hood trying to wield a big torque wrench like this when one, half the size or so will do. We talked a bit about accuracy. To me, the digital ones are more accurate. They also don't require recalibration, so that's a huge selling point. You can change the torque setting from inch-pounds to foot-pounds to Newton meters. A lot of them have torque angle, so you can torque it to 40 Newton meters and then do 90 degrees, all with the torque wrench. You don't have to mark it or use a torque angle adapter for your torque wrench. That's all great, but those are super expensive, like $400 or $500 expensive. I was actually looking at one on the tool truck the other day, and as awesome as they are, boy, that's a lot of dust to buy a torque wrench. So we need to figure out, most importantly, what we're going to do. Digital is awesome. Then you move to the clicker type, which is similar to this. There's different ways to set the torque. I will tell you, you guys could see that took a long time to spin all the way out to 200 Newton meters. So that's something you're going to want to think of. Typically they say don't rest it in any torque setting other than all the way at the end. So if you're torquing something to 200 Newton meters twice a day and you're running it in and running it out, that may take some time. Some of them have a little dial on the side that you roll that may be a little bit easier. Then you have the other kind, like the beam style torque wrench, which I don't think anybody really uses, especially for things like wheels. Those are great for turning torque. I have one. That's what I typically use it for. So they're good and they're accurate. It's just that's not what most people use. So, define what you're going to do with it. I think this is just fine of a torque wrench. I've used the 3/8 version a handful of times, and it works really well. At the shop, typically I use the Snap-on Tech wrench. It's the very first generation that had torque angle. I think I've used the torque angle on it like twice. So it's very rare that I use that. I would say if I were going to buy another one, I wouldn't buy one with torque angle. If you're torquing an axle bolt to 140 Newton meters plus half a turn, just put a little mark on the bolt and roll it around. If you're 3 degrees off half, it's not going to be a problem. You will be absolutely fine. If you're doing intricate engine work, that's a different case. So I'll throw a link down in the description about the Sonic Tools torque wrench. If it's only wheels and stuff like that, the clicker type is absolutely fine. Save the money and buy something else. Buy a better, smaller torque wrench, because I think, honestly, for me anyway, that's more important. Torque is important, but the lower the amount you're torquing something to, the more important it is to be accurate. Again, if you're torquing something to 150 foot-pounds and you're 2 foot-pounds off, it's not going to really matter a whole lot. If you're torquing something to 4 foot-pounds and you're 2 foot-pounds off, that's huge. So define what you need it for, go from there, but I wouldn't spend a crap ton of money if you don't 100% need to on that high-dollar torque wrench. All right, next one comes from Dave. I've got a 2010 Tiguan Sport 2.0 TSI, and the large fan has been coming on fairly loud in traffic. It seems to come on for 30 seconds, then stay off for 10 to 15, then come back on. Once the car is shut off, it runs for a little while, as it always has, then turns off, which seems like normal cool down. I've noticed a small fan come on with the AC when starting the car, which also seems normal, but it didn't seem to come on when the car gets hot to help the big fan. Took it to a VW dealer. They did get a code indicating cooling fan 2 was faulty. They replaced the small fan, cleared the code, rescanned, was clear, but I still feel the large fan is working harder than I remember. Everything I read indicates the fan controls are in the large fan, which wasn't swapped out. Car temperatures all seem good. Can't seem to find a detailed explanation of how the cooling fans operate in relation to specific feedback, speed, outside temperature, water temp, oil temp, and more. Any opinion would be appreciated. All right, let's chat cooling fans on the 2 liters. You are 100% correct. The module's in the big fan. You got a code for the small fan. The small fan very well may have died, or the module might be bad and it wasn't powering the small fan. It really depends on how they fail. It could go either way. Typically what I do is I output test the fan. I drop the shroud, right? Because the connector between the 2 fans is actually behind and you can't get to it. So I drop the shroud, which is super easy. It's the belly pan off, which is the hardest part on the Tiguan, and 4 bolts. Drop it out, output test it. That powers full power both fans. We can unplug them and make sure we have power to the small fan. If you got power to the small fan, you know your module's good. Most likely, at least that section of the module is good. If your fan doesn't come on when you do that, the small one, then replace the small fan. It is not uncommon, and you kind of alluded it, it's not uncommon to have both fans going bad. You have one fan that goes bad, the other one, has to work double time, and that begins to wear that fan out faster. So odds are you probably had 2 bad fans. It was just one was dead and one was dying. As far as input from sensors and modules and all that stuff, here's the deal. These are called smart fans. Now, just how smart they are really depends on what the module controlling it is, but these are smart fans, so they're gonna come on when they're supposed to. It's gonna be powered by the ECM when the engine coolant temp gets too high, or it's gonna be powered when the air conditioner comes on. So, or a handful of other scenarios. So there's parameters when these fans are supposed to come on, and basically if the car doesn't see the fan come on, whether it's through a feedback circuit or whether it's through, let's say, a drop in coolant temp, as it's reading that, it's gonna usually store a fault because it knows, hey, the fan's not coming on. We can also look to malfunctioning cooling system faults and point them to failing fans, because when you have a malfunctioning cooling system, the ECM basically sees the change in coolant temperature isn't happening in the way that it's supposed to. Either the car's not warming up fast enough, the car's warming up too fast, the car, when the fans are commanded on, the temperature's not coming back down. So there's tons, balled up and at play. It really all depends, which is the good thing, because it stores a fault typically when the fans fail, especially when the big fan fails. It's almost always gonna store a check engine light. So I don't know. At this point, it's one of those things without seeing it and experiencing what's going on. It's hard to put my finger on and say, that's the problem. Odds are, like my gut says, you probably have a main fan that's starting to fail. The small fan perhaps died, overworked the big fan. Now we need both fans, which is pretty common. So, all right, next one comes from Matthew. Today, a check engine light popped on my dash. I have an '07 GTI, and I know the PCV valves are known to fail. So when it threw the codes P0171 system lean and P0441 EVAP emissions incorrect purge flow, I wasn't worried. But I have a symptom nobody seems to have, and that is when my heat is on and I take my car out of gear and immediately push the brakes, my revs stay at 1500 till I come to a complete stop. It seems to happen exclusively when the heat is on. Any thoughts on what it could be? Yeah, I do have some thoughts on what it could be. You probably got a vacuum leak. As simple as that sounds, right? So as far as the heat being on, I don't know if that's so much heat, like heat in your car related, as temperature related. So if you have your heat on, odds are it's a little cooler outside. I think the cool outside probably is playing more into it than the heat being on. You got a vacuum leak, right? We got a fault sort of pointing to that. We also have a purge fault, which kind of puts us in maybe the right direction, maybe not. These 2 liters didn't have a ton of places that can have vacuum leaks. We could have valve covers leaking. There's a couple of pipes that could be leaking. A boost leak, right, in the intercooler across the front. Anything like that could possibly be. Here's the most common places. If you find that purge valve, which is just to the driver's side of the throttle body, and you trace it back, you're going to eventually get to a T-fitting. One side goes to the vacuum pump. One side goes down, I believe, to the purge valve. trying to like play that back in my head, and the other side goes somewhere else, right? You're gonna find that the plastic on it is probably cracked and it's leaking. You have one on the back side of that pipe goes to the brake booster. You're gonna have maybe a leak there or at the brake booster. Typically, if you pop the engine cover up, leave the mass airflow plugged in and that throttle, that boost pipe or that intake pipe, you leave the intake pipe plugged in, you can pop the cover off and you can usually hear it because it's underneath the cover. Or if you just take your hand and wiggle it a little bit, usually it'll get really, really loud. The RPM gets stupid and the car gets pretty unhappy, may even start to misfire. So that's my guess. It's a T-piece. We replace them all the time. They're like 90 bucks. It's super easy to do. Now this could easily, very easily be two separate problems. You could have a bad purge valve and you could have a diverter valve that's failed. Those are common too. So you're gonna have to do some digging, do a good visual inspection first, check anything plastic that air travels through. Start with that, touch it, wiggle it. Don't be too aggressive with it because they get really, really fragile when they get mileage on them. But just a little movement, and if you hear a noise change or the RPM changes, you're on the right track. It's pretty easy. These, again, fail all the time. And I've seen them missed a handful of times too. So start there, and hopefully that's all it is. If not, just time to do some digging and start checking some parts. Diverter valves are really easy to take off. It's 3 bolts. Take it off, look at it. I've done a video on it. I'll try and link it up. You can check it out. The RPM weirdness is probably the car keeping the RPM high so that it doesn't shut off because it's got unknown air coming in and it's trying to compensate for that. So when you have unknown air coming in, it also adds fuel to try and level all that stuff out. So you just may be getting squirrely and it's doing that so the car doesn't shut off. All right, guys, got time for one more. This one comes from Edward. I have a few questions. Did you use a donor car, and how bad was the marriage of the wiring? I'm looking to do this swap, so any advice would be great. Love the videos. It looks like I cut off half of your question, Edward. Sorry about that. So what he's asking about is when I did the VR6 swap in the Cabby. I did have a donor car. Actually, I had 2 donor cars. One was a Jetta with the VR6. The other was another Cabrio that I mostly hoard interior parts out of and sent it to its most deserved death because that car was awful. So yeah, I had a donor car. I think the donor car is 100% the way to go. It's such an easier way to do it than to try and source, a bracket or a connector or anything like that. You have the harness, you have the engine, you have the manifold. If you get one with a manual transmission, if you're going to do that swap, you got the trans, you got all the parts you need right there. You also have the opportunity to take hundreds of pictures to see how routing goes and where a bracket goes and the orientation of a piece. It might be a little different in the Mark 1, but at least you'll have the Mark 3 reference or Mark 4 reference depending on which engine you're doing. As far as mating the wiring, if you're not sure, the best thing I would say if you're not sure, you can buy plug and play harnesses for this swap. Nothing Leaves Stock had them. I don't know if they still make them. I know Eurowise had them. I think it's still on their website, but it may be like made to order. There's also another place called S&P Automotive. I know they do a ton of custom wiring. I'll be sure to link all those things up for you to check them out. S&P is on Facebook all the time. Eurowise I've done a ton of work with. And when I did my swap, I was in a super hurry, so I actually bought my harness as well from Nothing Leaves Stock. It was a great harness, plug and play. They had provisions so you could make the coolant temp work, the tach work, the check engine light work if you wanted to, as well as communication for a DLC. So none of that stuff is hard, but you really do need the wiring diagrams for it so you can make sure you're mating them properly. But as far as actually just getting the engine started, the only thing you really need is power, ground, and fuel signal. The fuel signal side, I think, was on the body control side, and the rest of it, you just need power and ground. Obviously ignition switched. You don't want your ECM to be powered all the time. There's no need for that. So wiring isn't as scary as it seems like it could be or should be, but remember that you're taking this engine and putting it in a car. I always recommend when you're doing that, have as much standalone from the engine as you can. If you don't start mashing wires together from the old harness to the new engine harness, then you're gonna have less problems. When you start cutting open harnesses and trying to make it work, things get a little bit sketchy. That's how a lot of people get stuck on projects and end up selling them for a third of what they have into it. But if you take that as a standalone, make it work, and then start adding in coolant temp, check engine light illumination, that kind of stuff, that's a much better route to go. So hope that helps. I'll link up the Cabby project if you guys haven't seen that. It's an older project. We're done with it. Sold car, moving on to the Wookie. I kind of miss that car, but I am happy that we're able to work on the Wookie now. All right, guys, I'm going to wrap it up there. If you have any questions or comments, you know what to do. Hey, if you like this video, throw it a thumbs up on YouTube. I always appreciate that. You can also subscribe on YouTube or on the blog at homebuiltmechanic.com. Follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course on Snapchat. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. I felt way off today, like way off. I feel like I whiffed on questions. I talked super fast. I'm not in a hurry or anything. It's just wild. So what do you do? No drink of the day either. Maybe that's the problem. No drink of the day.